Welcome to Inside Economics. I'm Mark Sandy, the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, and this is a special bonus edition of Inside Economics. We are going to be tackling the question of Russia, Ukraine, and what it all means for the global economy. And I'm joined, we're missing one of our co-hosts, Ryan Sweet, who's struggling to get in. I'm sure he'll figure it out at some point. And also Chris Dorides. Hi, Chris, Deputy Chief Economist. Welcome.
Hi, Mark. Thanks.
Good to have you. And the man of the hour, Gaurav Ganguly. Gaurav is our colleague in Europe, and he is the head of EMEA Economics, European, Middle East, and Africa. And welcome, Gaurav.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, Chris. Good to be on the show.
Yeah, and we have a lot to talk about. As I said, we are focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I thought about using the word kerfuffle, but that doesn't feel significant enough, right? So I should say conflict. Yeah, conflict.
Incursion. I think
incursion.
I think
potential
Biden
incursion.
said incursion, but
He used the word incursion. Okay.
Yeah. But that might be a little too strong.
It, Rob? What are you?
I sort of flip between saying incursion and invasion, depending on how I feel about the whole thing.
Oh well, yeah, good point. Okay, well,
there is a dark view in Europe. Robert Habeck, Vice Chancellor of Germany, said that we're facing the prospect of war on Europe's soil for the first time in 70 years. So certainly on this side of the Atlantic, some of the views around this conflict and the escalation of this conflict quite somber.
Yeah, appropriately so. Hey, one other nomenclature issue. Do you call the capital of Ukraine Kyiv? I believe that's the way the Ukrainians pronounce it, or Kiev. I believe that's the way the Russians pronounce it. How do you pronounce the capital?
Well, I should probably indicate my sympathy and say Kyiv.
Yeah, okay. That's my instinct here. And I think most major media outlets, at least here in the U.S., are now saying Kyiv, because it's the way the Ukrainians pronounce the capital's name. Okay, so that we set the ground rules here. So it's an incursion until it becomes an invasion, and it's the capital is Kyiv. Okay, and I should say EMEA, Europe. I said European, Middle East, and Africa, and Gaurav, you joined us now. Wow, almost 5-6 months ago now, I think.
5 months ago, I think. 5 and a bit months
ago.
Very good.
Yeah. Well, we got you on the hot seat here, so thanks for doing all this work. And we've got a lot planned with regard to our efforts to analyze this this incursion. This is the first thing that we're doing, this podcast, so we'll give you a sense of how we're thinking about things. We do have a webinar. Gaurav is going to lead the way. That comes next week, I think February 24th. Invitations are going out for that. We are running a number of different scenarios. Obviously, a lot of uncertainty here. Who knows how this is going to play out? So we are considering different scenarios. We're running that through our global model and producing forecasts based on those different assumptions around what happens in Ukraine and Russia, and putting that into databases for people to use. And that'll be available sometime next week as well. And finally, Gaurav, I think you said you're writing a white paper to kind of explain all this.
That's right. You got the timeline exactly right.
So by the end of next week, we pretty much should have all our analysis available for clients to use and for people to take a look at. But here we are, and how are things going there? Can you, Gaurav, just give us a lay of the land politically? I mean, I know it's very difficult because it's very fluid. A lot of things changing this morning. Here we are talking the morning Eastern time of February 15th, Tuesday, February 15th, and already a lot of news today. So how are you thinking about things? What's the lay of the land with regard to this issue?
Well, as I said a moment earlier, at least in some quarters in Europe, the mood is quite somber, and it is a fairly worrying situation. Some say that this is fairly par for the course, that about every year this time for several years, Putin sent troops close to the Ukrainian border. But what's happened this year, I think, sort of makes some of the events of previous years pale in comparison. We've seen significant troop build-up for the last couple of months. We worried about troops in the eastern part of the country first, but now we're increasingly also worried about troop build-up in the northern part of the country, fairly close to Kyiv. Now, Putin says that that's all been planned and signaled in advance. These are joint troop movements with the Belarus, typically conducted around this time of year, but the timing is curious, and the troop movements have been quite alarming, at least from a NATO perspective. Now, when we look at some of the things, some of the demands Putin has made, it seems like they are quite extreme. So he issued a set of demands to NATO, as you're aware. As I think everybody's aware now, everybody's following this quite closely, asking for NATO to pull back their troop movements and basically revert to their 1997 position. Now, that's unacceptable to NATO, I think. So if that sets the bar below which he's not willing to negotiate, then that's a bar that's just impossible to meet. NATO has advanced in successive stages since the fall of the Soviet Union, and with plans, and it had actually planned to include the Ukraine as part of NATO, which I think is completely unacceptable to Putin, but equally to roll back to 1997 would be absolutely impossible. So then that means that if that's the bar that he set, and if that's not a bar that's ever going to be met, then where do we go from here? I think that's the key question. There are a couple of possibilities that would still avoid conflict, and I think that is what's keeping up hope in Europe, that we don't have to necessarily go down the route of an incursion, far less a full-blown invasion, that there are diplomatic possibilities available to Europe and to Russia. And that probably might even be reflective of the comments made by Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday, when he said that it would be possible to find a diplomatic solution to which Putin gave his assent. Now that probably focuses on what's been happening in the eastern part of the country ever since 2014. When
Can I ask, so there's been a couple pieces of, I guess, good news. I mean, markets this morning are responding positively. You mentioned Lavrov, the foreign minister, saying something publicly to Putin about, perhaps there's a diplomatic path forward. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but that's kind of roughly what he said, which seems somewhat encouraging. And then we hear that the Russians have announced that they're pulling back some of the troops on the border. I don't know if they are or not, but they are announced that they are. That's what their intention is. And markets are interpreting that positively. Stock prices are up, oil prices are back down. How do you handicap all of that? I mean, what do you think's going on? Is this as positive as people seem to think, or obviously we don't know, but what's your sense of that?
So, as you said, we don't know. It's really hard to get a line of sight into what's going on in Putin's head at the moment. It probably requires somebody with considerably greater, strategic acumen than I have. But if I look through some of the noise that's been going on over the last few days, the kind of noise that you outlined very, very clearly, Mark, then I'd say that the general tone of the discussion has turned a bit darker in the last week. So I guess maybe a week ago I would have said there's a 50-50 chance of some sort of incursion into Ukraine versus troops actually pulling back and some kind of negotiated settlement. And I get the feeling now it's a bit worse than that. That there's still a significant path to no incursion, which might be somewhere closer to 40-45%, but it's probably, the balance of probabilities probably shifted over to some kind of incursion, 55.
Interesting. So what you're saying is the improvement in market sentiment is misplaced in your view. I mean, your thinking has gone in the other direction here.
Yeah. And actually, maybe what we look at is not just today's pullback in markets, but the fact that there's been a bit of extra volatility in markets because we're seeing in the last few days, because we're seeing pronouncements go in either direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I guess it's a question of degree as well, right? Or
exactly.
It's not just invade, don't invade. There are different levels of invasion. And it could be that markets are interpreting this as perhaps a bit of a concession, but that certainly doesn't rule out an invasion of the Donbas region, for example. So maybe the probability of a full takeover is lower, but
I think that's right.
Agree, or is that are you still pessimistic?
Markets are focused on the tail risk, and they're saying, oh, that looks less likely, but it doesn't mean that the probability that they might actually invade the Donbass region. And we'll come back. Maybe we'll let Gaurav explain all that, but that's a less aggressive incursion or invasion that feels more likely then. That's kind of what you're saying.
I think I guess it's the question to Gaurav. Is that what you're interpreting, or when you say you're a little bit more pessimistic, is it that tail, or is it in the middle?
I think that's right. I'm probably even a little bit more pessimistic than what you've just outlined, Chris. That I kind of feel that tail kind of scenario is probably roughly the same. Maybe it's gone down a bit. There are some bits within the tail that are very remote. And I'll come back to those later. In fact, one of our scenarios touches on some of the really remote things that could happen in the tail. But I think you're right in that markets are probably thinking that some kind of inversion, maybe into the Donbass region, is possibly slightly more likely, but that's palatable.
Can I?
Outcomes, economic outcomes from those would be palatable.
We're going to go down these different scenario paths shortly and make that very explicit and clear in people's minds in terms of how we're framing this in terms of scenarios and probabilities. But before we do that, and again, these questions are, obviously who knows, but I'm just curious what you think, and Chris as well. What is the end game here? What do you think is going on really? Why is Putin doing this? What does he hope to accomplish, at the end of the day here? Do you have a sense of that, or do you have any view on that?
Well, I've been thinking about this long and hard and trying to figure out what exactly Putin wants. And I gave up on economics at this point and started reading history. And discovered the really long, rich history that the Ukrainian people have and their long connection with different parts of Europe, from Poland and Lithuania through to Russia. But then I kind of fast forwarded all of that to about 2010, 2011, when Ukraine first expressed an interest, started to express a serious interest in getting closer to the EU. And there was talk of trade association with the EU, which ultimately led to Russia interfering in Ukrainian politics and having the Ukrainian premier removed, which led to people's protests and subsequently then incursion into Donetsk and Lugansk and the Crimean takeover, or supporting the separatists in Donetsk and Lugansk in the eastern part of the country and the Crimean takeover. So that was very clear that Putin was very unhappy with the state of affairs with Ukraine getting closer and closer to Europe, not just NATO's proposal to actually extend its front further eastwards and envelope the Ukraine. So all of that somehow Ukraine, having formed as an independent state in 1971 after the fall of the Soviet Union, now actually being absorbed into Europe, absorbed into NATO, seems to be completely against Putin's thinking. I think he feels that he needs to leave his legacy, and in his legacy, it's got to be that Ukraine, or the Russian favored part of Ukraine, actually returns to the fold, which does make me think that there's still a significant possibility that he will be content with an outcome where that happens without necessarily having to send his troops in. And there are different ways, we can get onto that later. There are different ways in which that can actually happen. So that's what I think his motivation is. I think that by setting the bar so high with NATO, he may have, he may have miscalculated, or he may not. To be honest, it's really hard to tell. But I don't think that's what he's after. He's not after NATO actually going back to its 1997 border, because I'm sure he must surely recognize that that's completely impossible.
Yeah, okay. So it's really not about NATO per se. It's just really about the eastern part of the Ukraine, which is, in his view, historically, that's been Russia. I mean, that's part of Russia, and therefore, I want that back.
I think that's right. I think it's about more than just the eastern part of Ukraine. It's about getting back the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine back into Russia, and making sure that Ukraine, I guess if that means that he's got to play a fairly destructive game to make sure that the Ukraine doesn't move towards the EU or towards NATO, then he'll do that.
Yeah, and I suppose also maybe it's just a test. I mean, maybe he didn't really expect to gain anything with regard to NATO, but hey, why not probe here a little bit? I mean, just see how they react, and what, maybe there will be it would create some fissures between NATO allies, between, the Germans, who are tied very closely to Russia via, the natural gas that flows to Germany, and the rest of NATO. Maybe that's part of what he's thinking too.
That could well be. That could well be. Certainly he played his hand very well in terms of restricting gas supplies to Europe.
Yeah.
Taking advantage of the winter season to do that. He also restricted Russian wheat exports in December, ostensibly to preserve domestic consumption, but actually that's not been that great for wheat prices either. And certainly he's gained a lot of really good publicity. If you imagine that Putin all he's had to do is put 100,000 troops near the border with Ukraine, and every single major world leader has flown over to meet him as a result. You'll recall that meeting with Macron on the big white table. I mean, that's just,
Yeah.
I guess that's just
What a picture, right?
What a
I
picture,
mean,
exactly.
the table was of a football field. It looked like
That's
Putin was
right.
on one end, Putin was on one end, and Macron was on the other. It was pretty bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think
Um,
and he's managed to show the world that he's prepared to align himself with China, and that China is willing to have that, and that they're willing to deepen their economic relationship. I don't know what that really means, how meaningful that is in the long run, but at least it's a sign.
Yep. Yeah. Chris,
I
you were
think
gonna
at a
say something?
minimum, yeah, I think at a minimum, he's now solidified Ukraine as a buffer state, right? The West is not going to embrace NATO or embrace Ukraine into, or bring Ukraine into NATO anytime soon, right? Because of these tensions. So that alone might be enough, right? I just want to make sure that, or he just wants to make sure that Ukraine is in the middle there as a buffer, doesn't want any troops on his
Yeah, good point. Because
borders.
they were flirting with becoming part of NATO, I guess, and yeah,
It's
this
gone back
kind of
and forth over the years. So
Yeah.
I think that is really off the table now.
Right.
Maybe not explicitly, but implicitly for
Right.
the foreseeable future.
Hey, let's talk about the scenarios then. So I guess this is kind of if you think about it, a tree of possibilities. In the kind of the first branch is, invasion, no invasion, right? So how do you think about that, Gaurav, and how do you handicap, that part of the probability tree?
So I think, as I was saying earlier, I've become a bit more pessimistic about the prospects of some kind of incursion into the Ukraine over the last week. Whereas a week ago, I was much more even about it, thinking it's about 50-50. I now think it may be more like 45-55 or even 30-60 on a dark day.
40-60.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, 40-60. Getting all these numbers, all these probabilities
Right.
in my head. So I kind of veer between these kinds of this sort of a boundary right now. So a bit more negative around the possibility of no incursion. But let's be clear that even not sending troops in doesn't mean that Putin's not going to interfere with the Ukraine. Right? So I think the possibility that actually Putin takes his troops back from where they are now, that he completely leaves Donetsk and Lugansk alone and doesn't try to interfere with Ukrainian domestic politics and acquiesces to NATO's wishes to enfold Ukraine, virtually zero. There's no way that's going to happen.
Yeah, right.
Which means that when we talk about no incursion, what we mean, and this speaks to Chris's point, that he's going to continue to interfere with the Ukraine for some time to come. He's going to continue to want to weaken the Ukraine's sovereign structure, the relationship of provinces with the central government, weaken them, make sure that these provinces become more federalized, that they have greater freedom to align themselves with Russia if they wish. And he'll be willing to, fight proxy wars or even encourage regime change in order to get it. So that's the no invasion scenario, which is not really that great an outlook for the Ukraine.
Okay, let's stop there for just a second. So one question is, okay, that I guess that's the most positive possible outcome here, that Russia does not actually invade. Certainly, they're going to interfere and they're create havoc, but they're not going to invade. If that's the case, what does that mean in terms of? I think the most the kind of the benchmark we're using to assess the economic consequences of what's going on there is oil prices. So oil prices, if you look at Brent, which is kind of the globally traded price, that's close to, well, last I looked, was close to $95 a barrel. That feels like that's up $10, $15 a barrel on the Russian news. I mean, it was up anyway because of demand supply dynamics coming out of the pandemic. Demand picked up faster than supply, and there's a lot of things going on with OPEC and North American fracking, and therefore prices were up. But the problems in Russia, Ukraine have added 10, 15 bucks a barrel. So my question to you is, that sound about right? And does that come out of price, do you think, if we go down this more positive scenario of no invasion?
I don't see that it comes down a whole lot if he simply backs his troops away, because there'll always be the fear of some renewed threat. Maybe some of it comes back down, there'll be some relief in the market, I guess, as he does this. So yeah, I can see some of it coming back down, but overall, he's still going to be very connected with the Ukraine. He's still going to be very interested. But it's less oil that I worry about, to be honest, Mark. It's more European gas that I worry about.
Mm-hmm.
And here I think, I struggle to see the stress go away at all, even if he steps back, because Russia has such a strained relationship with Ukraine when it comes to the supply of gas through the Ukraine into Europe. And it's going to do whatever it can, I feel, to simply reduce that supply and deny the Ukraine transit fees from gas. So they're very keen to have Nord Stream come online. Now, Nord Stream will carry about 55 billion cubic meters a year. That's Nord Stream 2. That will double the entire Nord Stream capacity. Nord Stream 1 has the same capacity. So there'll be an entire 110 billion cubic meters of gas that can flow outside of the Ukraine, directly under the North Sea into Germany. Ukrainian gas, its capacity is currently about 45 billion cubic meters. It carries much less because Gazprom simply refuses to supply the gas via the Ukraine. And I can't see that pressure goes away, that suddenly we'll have full flow of gas through the Ukraine. Europe gets what it needs, and maybe even Nord Stream comes on because Europe feels comfortable with Nord Stream operating. So I think those pressures remain. Maybe it takes Nord Stream some time to come online. It might be out to the end of the year to get various regulatory approval, etc. And at that point, maybe we start to see gas prices starting to come down. But then we're also going into winter at that point. So if we go through a stressful summer, Europe simply will be going into the next winter in a fairly vulnerable position without enough gas in storage. So I can see pressure on gas remaining for some time. And that's pretty bad from a Europe perspective and inflation in Europe.
Yeah, it's a good point. So, from a kind of a parochial U.S. perspective, I'm focused on oil, but because gas does these natural gas markets are generally local markets. So, what the price here of natural gas, it's elevated a little bit because of what's going on in Europe through liquefied natural gas demand, that kind of thing. But it's pretty much on the margin. As here in much of the rest of the world, the economic fallout from what's going on in Russia, Ukraine is through oil prices. But in Europe, you're right, it's mostly about natural gas because, correct me if I'm wrong, I think about a third of European gas comes from Russia. And just to level set for the listener, the main way of getting natural gas from Russia to Europe is through the Nord Stream. I'm sorry,
Well, there are four pipelines, Mark.
Four pipelines.
There are four principal pipelines that carry gas from Russia into Europe. And you're right, it's about a third of Europe's gas requirement. The rest comes from places like Norway, Algeria, some from LNG terminals, and a declining part of it from domestic production in the Netherlands. Now, that's actually a bit of a problem, the domestic production in the Netherlands, because the Dutch shut down on production, and it's on a steeply declining trend over the past few years because they've been experiencing earthquakes in the north of the country where these gas fields are. So that's meant that reliance on Russian gas has actually sort of increased over that period of time. But yes, there are four pipelines that bring gas into Europe. The one that I was talking about, the one through the Ukraine, supplies a bunch of Central European countries. And that's the one that's, of course, had a fair bit of spare capacity. And again, as you were saying,
the Russians want to shut that down basically and move it up to Nord Stream 2, which is the second pipeline that goes through the kind of the North Sea into Europe, which is directly from Russia into Europe. They want to use that instead of going through Ukraine. And
that's my sense of it. Of course, Russia hasn't said that.
Yeah.
It's important to note that that's not Russia's stated intention, but it would clearly be another lever, another bit of pressure to bring to bear on the Ukraine if Nord Stream 2 were to operate, because that's 55 billion cubic meters of gas right there bypassing the Ukraine. And if you take the second pipeline that the second North European, or the third North European pipeline, if you take Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, and then the third pipeline that runs from Belarus into Poland and Germany, then you would get in total about 160 billion cubic meters. That's almost sort of half of what Europe gets from, or more than half of what Europe gets from Russia in a year. So at that point, Russia is in a hugely strong position when it comes to negotiating with the Ukraine. The other point to make is that the Gazprom's agreement with the Ukrainian pipeline distributor, Naftogaz, runs out in 2024. So right now there's a long-term contract and long-term commitment to supply a certain volume of gas to the Ukraine, but that's all up for grabs in 2024. So if you get Nord Stream 2 up and running before then I think, if we're going back to that scenario of continued interference in the Ukraine, that's a very powerful lever.
Yeah. So 40% probability of no invasion, but regardless, there's still, and maybe global oil prices come in a bit, but gas prices, natural gas prices going into Europe remain elevated. And of course, the uncertainty around those supplies will remain very, very high going forward. One other question about that before we move on to the other scenarios. It seems, from a European perspective, that this is a bad arrangement. That they need to be working regardless of what happens. Even if Russian pulled all 130,000 troops off the border and went back to their barracks, after all this, wouldn't you really be working pretty hard to get off of Russian gas? I mean, LNG seems the most likely way you would go. And by the way, I just saw a statistic. I think if you look at the share of natural gas coming into Europe, LNG is now the highest share. It's higher than Russian. It's more than a third. Yes, and it's rising very quickly. But it feels like you would just go into hyperdrive on LNG, liquefied natural gas, and try to get that from Middle East, maybe from the U.S. I don't know, that kind of thing. Is that part of the discussion? You would think
it is. It certainly is, and you're right. LNG supplies since the start of this year have really ramped up, and there've been many the stories of vessels just queuing to get into deep sea ports in France and in southern Europe to offload their stocks. There's of course a capacity constraint there. You can only offload so much, and then you've got a capacity constraint at regasification plants because the liquefied natural gas has to be gasified again and then sent up through a pipeline. But that broader story of why on earth is Europe not doing more to actually diversify away from Russia? I think this is also a typically European problem once again. So Europe has taken a bunch of measures over the last 10 years to improve its gas security and its gas efficiency in particular. So it all started out with having gas pipes flowing through Europe, carrying gas from Russia across European countries, but they only went in one direction, or they largely went in one direction, which was to their destination. So you couldn't do effective demand management as a result. So then gas interconnectors were improved to allow gas to flow back, and that improved energy efficiency. At the same time, deep sea ports started to be built to increase the capacity for LNG. And all of that takes time. And also, I guess it occurs at a typically European pace because there are 27 member nations to deal with an agreement that has to be, you've got to get agreement from all sides before you can do something big. So now I guess what this shows is that energy security simply is really top of the agenda, and having a unified energy storage solution, for instance, is quite important. So there are gas storage facilities across Europe, but each country does its own thing. That's also not an optimal arrangement. You actually need Europe to be acting as one in buying and storing gas and agreeing to distribute it across countries. You've got to have greater ability to source LNG. That's not an overnight solution. In addition to having to build ports, lots of LNG is supplied on long-term commitments. So actually diverting LNG is not that straightforward. You've got to scale up renewables. That's got to be part of the solution. So it is possible, for instance, to double the pace of installation of solar PV. And you've got to do more effective demand side management and energy conservation measures. So a whole bunch of measures have to come together. Problem is that none of that's, of course, overnight. So Russian gas dependency doesn't really go away that soon. It's also really interesting. One more thing I'll say about it, which is Russia's own perspective on this. So in 2020, Putin brought in a Russia Energy Security Act, which sees Russian plans to diversify away from Europe out to 2035. So Putin really wants to sell more gas to Asia. But if he's going to do that, then Europe had better sit up and pay attention and work a lot harder to diversify away from Putin.
Yeah, makes sense. And I guess just as a quick sidebar, exacerbating all of this, of course, was Germany's decision back under Angela Merkel to mothball all the nuclear facilities for electricity. So they became very reliant on natural gas to power their electric utilities. And that's why almost half of the gas they consume comes from Russia, because they're so dependent on it. Just something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. That was a big energy policy mistake if ever I saw one. That was just such a knee-jerk reaction to Fukushima.
Yeah, right. Which was the Japanese facility that got nailed by the earthquake and tsunami. Okay, let's move on. So 40% probability, no invasion. We kind of talked about that. Now let's go down the other part of the probability tree, and that is invasion. And kind of lay that out, because there's different versions of this scenario. So give us a sense of that.
So we've talked a little bit about it already, and we mentioned the Donbass region and the possibility of invading there. And I mentioned Donetsk and Lugansk. So this again takes us back to 2014. So a little bit of history again, I guess, when Russia essentially supported separatists in 2 eastern provinces. And these eastern provinces declared themselves as quasi-autonomous states. And they've been basically fighting ever since with the Ukraine. Russia claims not to be supporting them, but of course it is. And a protocol was actually signed in 2015 called the Minsk Protocol that sought to bring all this to an end. So to have a ceasefire there, to have these provinces actually federalize and set their own foreign policy. That protocol never came about. And my feeling is that a big win for Putin would be to actually get that protocol revived and to see these 2 provinces in eastern Ukraine be firmly in his hands, just as much as Crimea is in his hands right now. So I guess one of the paths down to invasion would be to say that actually Putin is not going to achieve that through diplomatic means, and therefore simply has to send troops into that part of Ukraine, and actually into the wider eastern part of Ukraine, which is called the Donbass region. That's actually a fairly big region, and it could be quite difficult for him to even hold on to that region for a long period of time, but it's certainly doable. And he may even then, to send a message to the West and to the Ukrainian regime, go beyond the Donbass region, so sort of extend a little bit further west, and that would be one scenario.
What kind of probability? Okay, now we're down the incursion invasion probability part of the tree. What and that has a 60% probability all in. What percent of the total possible range of outcomes would be this? Okay, I'm going to invade the eastern provinces, the Donbass region of Ukraine, and stop there, or go a little bit further into the western part. But that's that scenario. What kind of probability would you attach to that?
That's my main incursion scenario.
Okay.
Everything else I see is in the tail, so I'd be putting upwards of 50% on that one.
And that's 50% of any possibility.
Of any possibility. That's full. I'd be putting somewhere between 50 to 53, 54% probability on that occurring. Okay. So if I put 40% on no invasion, and I'm putting up to 50 to 53% on this particular outcome, that's the tail.
Okay, so this is the most, in your view, likely scenario.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I would see as the most likely.
This would be your baseline then.
It kind of is in terms of in terms of his actions. Yes.
Okay, interesting. Okay, very interesting. Okay, so let's think about that for a second in terms of the economic implications. Or well, first of all, it sounds like if he does that, there's going to be some reaction from the West, from Europe and the U.S. So in that scenario, what kind of response do you think we'd see here?
So I think there's got to be some reaction. And from the US, I think there's got to be a fairly clear reaction. I'm less convinced about what Europe might do and how Europe might play along to anything that the US does. So for so many reasons, it's important for the US to stand up to any incursion into Donbass, including wanting to send the Chinese a clear message about international politics. So that's clear. It's less clear that the Europeans would at this point be completely unified in their response, because we'd have to look at what exactly it is that the US does. Now, a number of options have been outlined. It might be worth just stepping through some of these. These include sanctioning individuals in the Russian government or in Russian companies, and extending that out potentially to include even Putin himself. There could be sanctions levied on banks. Now, don't forget that these sanctions to some extent already exist. Russian banks, etc., have been sanctioned since 2014 in the Crimea crisis. So now we're talking about ramping up those sanctions. There is the possibility of actually killing the Nord Stream 2 project. Now we can talk about how that could be done and whether it would be feasible to do that. But there's certainly the possibility that exists of actually sanctioning Nord Stream 2 itself. And I guess What else could they? What else could what else could America do? What else could the US do? Those kind of become pretty big sanctions, right? You could, as a big, potentially a fairly big measure, exclude Russia from the international payment system known as SWIFT, so that Russian companies seeking to do business and make payments, at least abroad, would not have access to a payment facilitation system. They'd have to really resort to fairly old-fashioned methods like sending faxes in order to get payments done, which would be very, very costly for them. Actually, it would be a big blow for Gazprom, because Gazprom, of course, wants European revenues, and it wouldn't be able to clear its payments very easily. Again, we can talk about how feasible all of that is, and that's where I struggle, because a lot of these measures involve getting the Europeans to buy into these sanctions. SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium. It's a cooperative, it's a neutral company. So to get the Europeans to agree to actually bar Russia from SWIFT, that's a big step. Nord Stream 2 is a big step. You'd likely see a certain amount of European discontent in terms of agreeing to sanction Nord Stream itself. Don't forget that some Nord Stream activities have been sanctioned under US sanctions for several years, particularly the laying of pipelines. But I think we're talking about something bigger now. We're talking about actually blocking Nord Stream and ever allowing it to become operational. I think that would meet a fair amount of resistance. I suppose if we come to sanctioning Russian banking system en masse, completely blocking them out of international system, that's going to hurt the Russian people a lot. You could argue that that's not the desire of such sanctions, but you could equally argue that this time it has to be because of the nature of Putin's actions. So there are lots of challenges with these sanctions, but those are basically the types of sanctions that could be levied. And I think that some of the harshest sanctions probably won't be levied in this particular scenario, not because perhaps, I don't know, again, I don't really have a clear line of sight into the US administration, but even if the US administration wants to levy every single one of these sanctions, I'm not sure the Europeans would buy into it.
Right. So there, there would be saying, oh, Chris, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so this scenario excludes any type of military response, at least not a direct one from the US or Europe. Is that correct? Is that in your tale?
It's a good question. I think we've constructed all our invasion scenarios, incursion stroke invasion scenarios, to exclude a military response from NATO, because that I think would be really very much a complete game changer. This is already a game changer, particularly our tail scenario where we do see a broader invasion of Ukraine. That's already a game changer. For NATO to take the step forward and send its own planes and infantry and cavalry in, I think that's something that could spark a lot of international sort of ructions.
So
although there could be a range. Oh, sorry, there could be a range. It could be certainly just assistance to Ukrainian forces. Is that part of your scenario?
I think
or is a military
part of the scenario that's already happening. So it's actually sending arms to
additional
happening, and in fact you can build that out further if you like, because Russia has of course got so many frozen conflicts around the region in Georgia, Chechnya, etc. So you could easily see in a scenario like this that over a longer period of time, Western allies actually start to fight proxy wars with Russia in those regions. So I think it's very destabilizing for the geopolitics of the region as a whole. And we're not just limited, the scenario is not just limited to Putin sending troops in and then facing sanctions. There is a slow burn, which is very geopolitically negative for the region.
So in this scenario where Russia invades the Donbass region, there will be some sanctions. What kind of, obviously hard to know how far the U.S. and the West will go, the Europeans will go. My read on what you're saying is they can't go all the way because there just won't be that kind of support from Europe to do that. But maybe Nord Stream 2 will be put on ice for a little bit of time, at least some period of time. I'd be surprised if that wasn't the case. President Biden said that was going to happen. So if that doesn't happen, I'd be surprised. The German chancellor didn't deny or say yes or no to that, but sounds like that would happen. There would be sanctions on individuals, no doubt about that. There would possibly be some restrictions on the use of international payment system, the SWIFT system, but that feels like a bridge that might be a little bit too far under this scenario. Okay, so if that's kind of sort of did I miss anything, Chris?
I just want, sorry, it's
No.
complex. Any other trade restriction? My understanding is Russia's a large exporter of aluminum, palladium, other things that are critical for the auto industry. Do you see those as being sanctions or some type of trade restrictions as well?
Let's take that one. Let's take that one separately, because that's another very complex political discussion. I think there could be other trade sanctions, and particularly restrictions on imports of machinery, cars, and that kind of thing, to hurt Russia. So telecoms equipment, mobile phones, TV sets, cars, etc. These could all face sanctions entering Russia, which would then lead to,
Yeah,
you can imagine what would happen to Russia. You'd have a collapse of the ruble, you'd have inflation, you'd have a massive contraction in consumption, and so on and so forth.
I think in this scenario, though, I don't think they want to do sanctions that are going to be more, net detrimental to Western economies, to the European economy. They don't want to do that.
That would be very difficult.
I suspect they won't want to go down that in this scenario. I'd be surprised if they did that.
So
because it's like shooting your what is it? What's that phrase?
Shooting yourself in the foot.
Cutting off your nose to spite your face, kind of thing. Yeah. I don't know. Is that a European phrase?
It's definitely a English phrase.
Yeah, English phrase.
There's something similar in one or two other European languages.
Yeah, but let me ask on that scenario, what is the economic implications of that? I mean, it doesn't feel like that's going to result in significant turmoil in financial markets. Maybe briefly when it's all happening, because there's the fog of what's happening and you don't know where it's going to all land, but not a prolonged period of financial turmoil, not a big impact on oil or gas prices. They'll remain elevated because there's going to be a risk premium, and they're kind of like what we talked about under this no invasion scenario, but it doesn't feel like this has big global macroeconomic implications.
Of its own, its impact is very largely limited to Russia. I think what matters is what Putin does next. So as you said, maybe Nord Stream 2 doesn't even have to be officially sanctioned. Europeans can simply drag their heels for a couple of years, and that's enough to do that, while they try and figure out whether they should or shouldn't impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and kill the project. You impose sanctions on some Russian companies, maybe even stop a few companies from using SWIFT, but let other companies continue to operate. Put some sanctions on exports of manufacturers into Russia. This is largely a Russian problem. I think the question then becomes, what does Putin do next? And in order for Putin to put pressure on the world, he's going to have to rely on the only two levers he has, which are oil and gas, and particularly gas into Europe. So I guess he would want to foster a sense of divisiveness in Europe. And a clear way to do that would be to show who's in charge when it comes to gas supplies coming into Europe. So you could see that he would use that lever a bit, maybe not a whole lot, because that's clearly detrimental to him as well. But you could see some reduction in oil supply into Europe, some reduction in gas supply into Europe. Maybe not a whole lot. We saw some reduction in gas supply in January, for instance, and then a pickup in recent days. But if we go back to that kind of level coming out of winter through the summer, that puts a fair bit of pressure on Europe when it comes to filling up its reserves and boosting its storage ahead of next winter. So you could see that you'd have a bit more pressure on European gas prices in this scenario for a few quarters at least, until the situation normalizes. Potentially even a bit of elevated tension in Brent for a few quarters, but nothing serious, nothing that's going to cause financial markets to melt down.
Okay, so just to summarize, the 55% probability goes to this Russia invades Donbass region. There's some sanctions put on by the U.S. and Europe. Russia responds, but this is kind of a temporary dislocation to energy markets and financial markets, and life goes on, and tensions remain high, but they don't boil over. And the 40% probability is no invasion, so we're kind of at 90-95%. So now the remaining part of the distribution of possible outcomes is kind of out there on the tail, on the dark side. Maybe 5 to 10% kind of probabilities. How would you characterize that dark scenario?
So I say that 5% in that tail, that's, again, it's a range of different things that could happen there. So to the full 5%, if I look at it, just coming out up to that 5%, that dark scenario is invasion on the eastern and northern front. So that troop buildup in the north with the border with Belarus on the east. There's a simultaneous incursion. Putin marches into Kiev, topples the regime. You've got tanks rolling down Kiev. And I think at this point, that's a very, very...
Kiev.
Sorry?
Kiev.
I beg your pardon. Thank you.
There you go. Okay.
At this point, it's incredibly negative for Europe. We go back to those comments about Europe facing prospects of a war for the first time in 70 years and a re-emergence of those Cold War divisions. So I think Europe is in emergency mode at this point. So that of its own is a very negative scenario, and it invites I think it really opens the way to inviting a united European and American response in terms of sanctions against Russia. This is much more national security over energy security, whereas I guess that first scenario was more Europe puts its energy security first over national security. So I think you should get very, very significant sanctions against Putin at this point, including shutting Gazprom out of SWIFT, shutting the entire system out of SWIFT, completely sanctioning Russian financial system, possibly even sanctioning Putin himself. And Russia just becomes a complete pariah state, which I guess, given how the FX reserves that Putin has and the fact that he's been building what they call Fortress Russia for the past few years, he may even be willing to countenance. But it's not going to be pleasant for Russia. I think what then matters is what Putin does next. And again, he comes back to his two levers. And I put very low probability on that he would actually then go out and really, really, really shoot himself in the foot. By turning off the oil and gas taps, so significantly reducing the oil and gas taps. But that's the scenario we've chosen to model as our dark scenario, where Putin actually does that. Not only does he invade Ukraine, both from the north and the east, not only is he then subject to very significant sanctions from the West, but he then takes that additional step of wanting to hurt Europe in particular by significantly restricting oil and gas supply. And that, I think, is quite negative, because at this point, we're facing, one, a geopolitical paradigm shift, B, a loss of gas supply that actually you can't replace that easily, a significant reduction in oil that can't be rerouted that easily. So this is all just very, very risk-off. It's a very risk-off environment.
Right. So that feels like that scenario, which broadly defines the tail of the distribution. It sounds like you're saying more like 5% than 10%. Has lots of different shades of darkness, obviously, and the shade that we decided to actually quantify through our modeling is way out on the tail. I mean, just kind of at the end of the distribution of possible outcomes in your mind. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization. I think for Putin to restrict oil and gas to that degree, that it results in a huge pickup in European inflation, for instance, that would be very, very damaging for Putin. As much as, of course, it would be damaging
Chris,
for the
you
world.
kind of, I saw your face. So
I'm always in the tails. We're not talking World War III. We're not talking about, right?
No, we're not.
Actual conflict. Right? I could certainly paint a much darker scenario for you if you'd like. So you're stopping there. So just to quantify, right? Because I think clients are talking about, well, what if there is more of a armed conflict, right? We're talking comparisons to World War II, Sudetenland, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's really...
We're not going to that degree. I mean, we're saying at worst, in this very dark scenario, the Russians do take over Ukraine, but then the border stops there. There's no additional incursion. And certainly troops are massing along that border, and it's hostile, but we're not going beyond that in terms of an armed conflict.
That's right. And I think going back to some of your earlier comments, Chris, we'll still see proxy wars being fought. We'll still see arms being supplied to Ukrainian troops. And it's not going to be easy for Putin to hold the Ukraine for a long period of time. So there's plenty of potential for conflict in that region. And of course, it's an incredibly dark geopolitical narrative for Eastern Europe and for Russia. But I think if we handicap that at about 3% probability, that's out in the tail, but not way out of the tail. I think you could go much further out into the tail with having full-blown conflict and NATO sending troops in, et cetera, et cetera. But Honestly, to me, that feels like that's incredibly remote.
Sure. No, but I think it's important to quantify.
Yeah, it's important. It's important to lay them out. Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even under this scenario, then trade is not restricted. It's not voluntarily restricted per se, right? They were still saying that the Europeans would still be willing to purchase gas, other goods.
Well, I
from
base
Russia.
that. I mean, I base that on the entire history of the Soviet Union, when even at the darkest hour of relations between the West and during the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, gas continued to flow into Europe. So I'd much rather characterize that scenario via Putin doing something negative on oil and gas rather than the West clamping down on Russian oil and gas.
Yeah.
So what does that mean, this scenario now kind of on the tail that we've kind of, I think, nicely put into relief? What does it mean for the economy, for the Russian economy, for the European economy, for the global economy?
So the Russian economy is hit so badly in the first scenario, and it gets hit much worse in the second, of course. It's the same levers. The ruble plummets, inflation spikes, consumption slows down, consumer disposable incomes are really badly hit. So that's and similar sorts of things would happen in the Ukraine as well. So we mustn't just think of Russia, but spare a thought for Ukraine and what happens there with war on its soil. But when we come to Europe, this is much worse for Europe because we'd actually see a significant pickup in inflation. So we modeled gas prices, European gas prices, at about close to 180 euros per megawatt hour. That's roughly what we saw back in December, when one of the big pipelines actually completely reduced supply for a few days. And European gas price futures spiked immediately to that kind of level. So if we see those sorts of prices coming back, maybe it won't stabilize at 180, maybe it comes down to 150 after a brief spike. But nonetheless, if it stays there for a few quarters because Putin deliberately restricts gas supply considerably, that's very, very negative for European inflation and European growth. I mean, there's going to be a huge squeeze on disposable incomes. We'd be worried about corporate investment. We'd be worried about corporate profits and revenues. So it would be a very dark picture for Europe for some time to come. And that's also going to spill over to the global economy, because we'd see elevated oil prices for a while. We're actually modeling Brent at $150 a barrel for several quarters. So that's going to have a knock-on effect on US and Asian inflation. And then we've got to think about accommodative responses, because this is clearly an emergency situation. So in Europe, you can see that fiscal policy and monetary policy will have to work together, but then it's a bit unclear as to how each will operate. Would fiscal policy choose to help households and help corporates, or one and not the other? Would monetary policy adopt a wait-and-see approach because it's such a negative emergency situation, but then that may have some negative consequences for inflation expectations? Would the Fed do something different because it's less of a problem? Inflation it'll be less of an emergency problem in the US.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's a pretty dark scenario. All righty. Well, a lot to think about, and I'm sure between now and next week when we have the webinar, there'll be a lot of changes in the moving parts that are changing pretty rapidly here. So we'll follow this very carefully and report back and make any changes to our forecasts and scenarios that we think are important to do. Any last comments? Anything we missed in the conversation? I thought it was a very thorough kind of discussion of possible outcomes here. Did we miss anything?
Got one quick question. I've heard something about around timing. I heard this statement from some military commanders that if there was to be an invasion of any type, it would occur within the next few weeks, while the ground is still hard. And that because once you get into the spring and it becomes very muddy, troop movements become very difficult. Is that, you give any credence to that, or any weight to that type of argument, that if something's going to happen, it's going to happen soon, otherwise we'll be in a stalemate for a while?
I mean, I'd heard yet another date put out there, which was the 20th of this month, after the closure of the Beijing Olympics, the Winter Olympics, that Putin would wait until then to make sure that the world was at peace and people could enjoy the Winter Olympics before invading. So it may be very, 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 very soon. There's certainly a case to be made for doing it sooner rather than later. But I guess he's also got to think about the optimal European response. The longer he has, more time he has to play with, the more chance he has of driving a wedge between the US and Europe. So And I get the feeling that he's just an incredibly strategic player who weighs all these things up very carefully.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Gaurav. That was very helpful, and putting it, making it very clear, how we're thinking about this. And again, we'll update our listeners and clients as we go along here. But thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going to call it a podcast. So thanks everyone for listening in, and we'll talk to you soon.